Hello and welcome along to the On the Whistle podcast. I'm your host, Zayn Nabbi. Joining me around Africa's biggest bride to talk about all things African football is the lovely Firdose Moonda, our women's football editor. She is freezing her cricket buns off in Cape Town. Firdose, fresh off the World Cup from your lounge. How are you doing?
Yeah, it's winter came late to the Cape, but it's here now. It's your summer anyway, so you won't feel sorry for me when I tell you what it feels like. It's about 14 degrees. It's cloudy. As you say, just done a Cricket World Cup, which South Africa reached the final, and then after that, that was where it ended. So that's all we need to say. But it's been an interesting couple of months in sport, and I think I'm also just watching and living vicariously through the Euros at the moment because I've really enjoyed that tournament. I
Sure.
took a lot of excitement out of that Portugal game last night, and I must say also seeing Cristiano Ronaldo cry was quite interesting. But Monday is going to be epic, right? Because we got Friday, not Monday, Spain and Germany, Portugal, France. So I've really enjoyed that, and I hope you guys are enjoying it as much as it looks like it's so enjoyable from afar.
No, absolutely. Similarly to the AFCON, lots of great storylines, lots of great games, and lots of drama. And, Ali, this is a good point to bring you in, Alasdair Howorth, our co host and also our multi platform reporter. Ali, did you listen closely to what Firdose said? It's 14 degrees in winter. Well, when I walked out my house this morning, it was 14 degrees in summer.
Zayn, yeah. As soon as Firdose said that, I brought up my app on my weather app on my phone, and it is currently 15 degrees and cloudy. So I've gotten you beat there, but it was raining earlier today.
Wow.
Yes, Firdose, it is cold and miserable in South Africa. Welcome to our miserable lives here in the UK in the Northern Hemisphere. Oh,
Exactly,
dear.
exactly. Whether you're in Edinburgh like Ali or London like me, it's cold. It's cold. Well, listen, it's always warm around our braai, and we've got a lot to get into as always this podcast. The two big talkers in this show really are going to be surrounding some of the news coming out of South Africa, the reports that are suggesting that Rhulani Mokwena will be leaving Sundowns as their head coach. And we have Firdose on our show, so it would be remiss not to dig in a little deeper about the WAFCON and its postponement. But first, let's start with the news of the day. Rhulani Mokwena, the man at the helm of Sundowns, the man who's been a key part of their dynasty, he appears to be leaving Firdose. What's the latest on that?
Yeah, so lots of reports today, Zayn, in the local press. And we don't have a thriving local press anymore. In fact, we've got 4 newspapers closing in a couple of months' time, and that's really the last of the print publications. So we've got lots to talk about from that department as well. But the reports online, from what we've seen, is that Rhulani Mokwena did not turn up to the training camp at the High Performance Centre, which is in Pretoria, where Sundowns train, and that there's been no explanation given for why he hasn't turned up. And the teams are getting back together now in preparation, so you would expect that he would be there. There's a lot of kind of, rumor mill is great in a lot of countries, and especially here. And there were a couple of posts on X, on, I don't know what we're calling it, X Twitter, where the speculation was rife that it would be announced that he had already left, either that he had wanted to leave or that he had been sacked. And I mean, that would seem a little bit strange, but that's definitely the talk, that he's not coming back, that something has gone wrong there, and that he's in fact nowhere to be seen and a little bit AWOL. So that's definitely made the headlines here. And before we kind of get some more in depth on that, I just want to say, Zayn, one interesting development also making news in South Africa, which I think we should keep an eye on this podcast and across all sporting codes, is that we have a new sports minister, and you may remember the name. It's Gayton McKenzie, who is the leader of the Patriotic Alliance, a rehabilitated convicted criminal who is now one of the members of parliament, and whose first pledge was to make something called slating or spacing, or essentially drag racing, legal. So I think we're in for a proper ride with the new sports.
I think we're in for a wild ride with Gayton McKenzie, right?
I think so. So I think we just need to keep an eye on that one.
Well, I heard Gayton speak many years ago at a sports event about his rehabilitation. It was a very inspiring listen at the time because he had
It is.
found a way to smuggle a camera into prison and record what really goes on in prisons in South Africa, and it was really investigative. But since then, he's courted controversy. I
Wow.
know that, Firdose, and we're not here to cast aspersions, but there'll be some who like him, and some will be very critical of him, and some
Yeah.
who would not like what him and his party stand for. But that is for another
And
show.
interesting that he got the portfolio, right? Which is, we've been through so many sports ministers recently. 2 sports ministers ago, we had one pledging that we'd get a professional women's league, which we can talk about as well. And that was a year ago, in fact, that
Well,
Zizi
let's put
Kodwa
that
was
to
saying
game.
such. And then, yeah, exactly. We will. We absolutely
Let's
will.
get him on. Let's get him on. Well, listen, Ali. We're not gonna, rough ride this with South African talk. It drives you mad. But let's bring it back to Rhulani. Oh wait, there's a South African story. And before we get into the analysis around how this move came about, the surprise, could you just remind our listeners, our viewers, just what a trailblazer he's been at Sundowns since coming in with the 3-man coaching team, Steve Kompela and Mamelodi, after the giant that was Pitso Mosimane before?
Yeah, I feel like he's not necessarily been a trailblazer, but he's certainly been like the star of the show because, obviously Sundowns, had this amazing success with Coach Pitso, and, he's been on the pod many times to talk about that and talk about why it then didn't work out and he left. And then as you alluded to, we had this kind of triumvirate of coaches, this trio of Mankoba and Steve Kompela and Rhulani, and then kind of very quickly became apparent that Rhulani was the kind of the star boy of the three, and then took charge. And then since then, he's won 2 leagues. This last league, they would have gone completely unbeaten in the PSL if it were not for a loss in the last game of the season. They won the inaugural African Football League. They cleaned up the tournaments. They've been to 2 Champions League semifinals in a row. And he's kind of revolutionized what it means to play dominant football on the continent. Particularly domestically, I think we've seen a level of dominance that we've never seen before. I think bar occasionally teams like Al Ahly can hit those heights. Even to be fair, this season Raja went undefeated. Had a terrific season in Morocco, but in terms of the absolute dominance that Sundowns had, I think it's important to appreciate, how dominant they were, how good they were, and I think it's such an easy comparison and a comparison we always make, but I think it kind of rides true as he is really the Pep Guardiola of Africa, in terms of the way he innovates tactically. Now he doesn't. In Europe, other coaches then follow in Pep Guardiola's footsteps, but in Africa, the coaches have not so much kind of followed. We haven't seen the same kind of possession, dominate positionalism, kind of take control on the continent. But just a brilliant mind. I think the best coach to come out of, with the potential to be the best coach to come out of Africa ever, in terms of his desire, his tactical ingenuity, and I think it's, while it's sad, it's also really fascinating because I think Pitso in many ways shattered the glass ceiling of black sub-Saharan African coaches going to North Africa, taking on Al Ahly, becoming their second longest serving coach and one of their most successful coaches of all time. And I think, in many ways, a lot of us have harbored this hope that maybe Rhulani will smash the next glass ceiling and the one after that. And so it's a sad time, but for Sundowns. And to see that relationship break down between him and the club, I think it's opening up a lot of potentially very, very interesting doors.
Well, we know that the relationship appears to be broken down and he'll be leaving. To many, this might seem as a surprise given the success at the club. To you, is it a surprise that he's moving on, Ali?
It's a surprise to me it happened this season. I think it's it's not a huge secret that things were tense between Mokwena and the leadership at Sundowns, whether that's, sporting director Flemming Berg or it's even Dolipe Motsepe and potentially, although he definitely doesn't own and run Sundowns, Dr. Patrice Motsepe. And we know that that can be a tricky relationship to manage, working under the Motsepe family. Pitso came onto this podcast and told us that, Patrice Motsepe was the reason why Sundowns weren't being successful, and he had to kind of, take control from him, and that ultimately was what led to him being sacked. And, there was such a frosty relationship. And I think that's been the case with Mokwena. I think Mokwena is one of these managers who wants complete control And I think with the introduction of a sporting director where they weren't quite fully aligned, I think particularly Mokwena wasn't happy about, some of the transfer targets as well as player sales. I think there has been that breakdown, and kind of we'd been hearing stories about this for maybe 6 months or so. But I personally thought that it would happen next season. I thought he would want another crack at the Champions League and the big one, the Club World Cup. I know there's question marks over it with some of the European foot player associations and clubs maybe pulling out. But for African clubs, we have to remember this is a huge tournament. And I think that he would have probably seen it as a chance to kind of show himself onto the world stage, because despite his success in Africa, because he hasn't won the Champions League, he's only won the African Football League. He hasn't had a crack at the Club World Cup. He hasn't had a chance to go up against some of these big countries or big clubs from Europe or from South America. So I think for me it was a surprise it happened this season, but I think the Sundowns gig is like many of these top African gigs. It's being completely successful just really isn't enough sometimes, and it's just the pressure, the kind of environment.
Well, you say that, and let me ask you this: we all know during the end of the CAF Champions League football season and the Premier Soccer League in South Africa, which Sundowns had dominated and were clear winners, there was a dip in performance with that Sundowns team, and it culminated with the 2 defeats to Esperance in the semi-finals. The biggest. Well, maybe not the biggest surprise, because I think people like Courtney were calling it earlier that Esperance went and won in South Africa. So do you not think, whether it's Flemming Berg, whether it's Tlopani, whether it's that brains trust that run it, that it was right to maybe think we need a different person to come in to get the best out of the players, because we're at the business end of the season, and this is where we've seen the biggest drop in performance?
Yeah, I think to an extent, right? Like, I think there is a sense that, like, yeah, maybe their performances have dipped towards the end, and you can see that. Oh yeah, they didn't kind of close out the PSL. They didn't close out the Nedbank Cup final, which they lost to Orlando Pirates. And then they obviously got knocked out in the Champions League. I think there are very strong mitigating circumstances, and I think we shouldn't read too much into one-off kind of results. For instance, in the CAF Champions League, they were the only team that played a midweek fixture. Every other major team was getting a week off to travel to North Africa. Meanwhile, Sundowns had to go play a midweek game. I can't even remember who it was against. They had won the league with 7 games to go. So, although there's the motivation to go unbeaten, there's not much to play for in that final game. And I think the bigger one is the Nedbank Cup final. I think that's probably the bigger one, where it's saying, okay, actually, Orlando Pirates are without a doubt Sundown's biggest challenger. Jose Rivero has done really well since coming in there. They play good football. They beat Kaiser Chiefs in that spectacular Soweto derby. And so for me, that's probably the biggest example of, okay, Mokwena maybe lost something. In terms of, does that mean that the team was on the downward term? I don't think so. I think that's incredibly harsh. But what I do think is interesting is them saying, if this relationship is breaking down, we have to pull the trigger now, because, I said it for Mokwena, but it's equally true for Sundowns. They really, really want to be, they really have targeted this Club World Cup, and that's what they're building towards. Yes, we don't know if it'll happen. Presumably it will. The mess that is the African Football League will happen again this season. They'll want to win that, retain their title. The Champions League is a big monkey that they want to get off the chest, like particularly not having won it in, 7-8 years, despite steamrolling everyone in South Africa. But for me, the big one is the Club World Cup. And so I think from the club's perspective, I think it is the right decision if things had broken down, because what neither party wants is then for them to go through a season of kind of discord. Yes, they'll win the PSL. Of course they will. But they then can't compete when it comes to that Club World Cup. So I think actually kind of from the club's perspective, it also does make sense. Give themselves a year, give the coach that's coming in a proper summer to really build into it a season that really, similar to this one, will culminate within that kind of really tight space towards the end of the season. And, maybe you're right, Zayn. Maybe that's where they found that Mokwena has been lacking, that yes, he can dominate for 9 months of the year, but it's that 1 month that is super important that he hasn't. But yeah, I think either way, it leaves us in like I said, quite an interesting position, both for Sundowns and for Mokwena.
Well, this will be my last question to you, Ali. Where do you think he'll land next?
That is a hard one, Zayn. I think there's been rumors that he wants to take a sabbatical again, going off the Pep Guardiola comparisons, take a year out, maybe go live in New York and play chess in the park or whatever. But think what is also interesting is that a lot of his coaching staff have also left, like Michael Lothman, his assistant coach, has gone with him. And I think for me that says that, and again, similar to Pizzo, it's almost like Mokwena is building a team that he'll be moving with. Now, if he goes to Europe, if he wants to try and make that jump, that will be tricky to bring staff with him. He probably wouldn't be able to get a top league job. He'd be looking at getting an assistant role potentially even, or kind of getting a coaching job at a kind of smaller league. I would love to see, we've seen some of the like kind of Scandinavian leagues open themselves up to African players, but would they be open to an African coach? Who knows? I think the more likely path is to kind of follow in Pizzo's footsteps, is to move to one of these North African giants. Maybe from there, then you can move to the Gulf, or then make the move to Europe. I think, which I would love. But again, Mokwena is an interesting guy. Like during the AFCON, he went to Brazil. He would like to meet with, I think, clubs from like Fluminense, to meet with Fernando Diniz, the kind of revolutionary, in quotes, I guess, Brazilian coach, who's done a lot. So I think he's the type of guy who would be really open to kind of exploring a lot of different options. And I think coaches like Pizzo Mosemane have shown that you can have these kind of different paths. I think another example, that is in some ways analogous. Obviously, the race thing is different, but Ange Postecoglou from Australia, coming from a footballing backwater, going to Japan to prove himself, and then making the move to Scotland, and then now to England to a big club. I think those kind of stories actually encourage you to say that, okay, actually, if he goes to Wydad or Esperance or Al-Ahli or Zamalek, that isn't him saying, okay, this is my ceiling, but it's actually just the next step in what is hopefully going to be a long and very successful career. And remember, he's very young. He's only like 37. He's not even 40. So, he's got a long time to keep building up that CV.
Well, this is my point. Why do you need a sabbatical at 37?
Well, I can give you an answer to that. I'm 37. I need a sabbatical.
So, sometimes I feel like I need one at 27. Yeah.
But I mean, this is like, don't even get me started on this. Don't even get me started on this younger generation, Gen Z, wanting a sabbatical at 37. What is 37? Like,
I'm all for that.
Look, we don't know.
Me too.
Reports, right? But I guess you can take a sabbatical and upskill. So I'm having a little fun there. Well, listen, if you're listening out there and you want to tell us where you think Rhulani will go, or if he needs a sabbatical, please, if you're watching this on YouTube, put your questions, put your comments in the comment section. Same thing on Facebook. And if you want to find us on Twitter, as Firdose calls it, X as Elon Musk calls it, please, tweet us, send us questions at OTW_podcast. And you can do the same on Instagram. We're there. Ali's still figuring out TikTok. I think. I know. I don't know. I'm not on TikTok.
He's young. TikTok. He has to be able to figure it out.
Wait, he's on sabbatical in Scotland. He can't do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, listen, guys, that is obviously great talking about the headlines of the day. But a story that I wouldn't like us to lose sight of is the WAFCON. That has obviously been the 2024 edition, was meant to be taking place in Morocco. That has subsequently been postponed. Ali, you've given us some perspective on that. But for those, as a women's football editor, where do you fall on this? I think it's quite obvious to say we've seen a number of players saying that this is going to set the women's game back. What's your take?
Yeah, really disappointing. And I think more so that the communication around the rescheduling was left until so very late. So you had countries who had qualified wondering for months and months amid rumors that the tournament wasn't going to happen when it was going to happen, and not being able to put plans in place. We saw Banyana use the international window to go and play some matches in Senegal. And Desiree Ellis almost saying, we're just sort of doing this to kind of do something because we're not actually sure what we're supposed to be doing at this point. And I don't know that I believe that the Olympics is the only reason, and in fact, even a good reason, for the WAFCON to be postponed. It's just the two teams. It's just Namibia and Zambia. And sure, it might have been asking a fair amount of them to play a continental tournament and then go to the Olympics or vice versa. But, this is professional football. Zambia have got the two highest women's football players in the world in their ranks. I have a feeling they know how to manage those things. And I think what I'm a little bit, semi-relieved about is that it's going to take place in the same window. So at least it will occupy that prime, it'll be summer window next year, 2025, 5 to 26 July. I also say that selfishly as somebody who likes summer. But, we know that that's the time when eyes are on international football rather than club football, and it's not going to get lost somewhere in December, January. Sorry for the men, because they will get lost somewhere in December, January, and that will only come at the end of next year. So I have a feeling the men are probably slightly more unhappy about their rescheduling. But another concern I've got is qualification. So teams qualified late 2023 to play a tournament mid-2025. So much can change in that time. Players can retire, coaches can come and go, other teams can become better, other teams can lose form. And I just think it's so unfair on everybody in Africa who tries so hard to. Our game is already so far behind the global north in terms of resources, in terms of finances, in terms of broadcasting, all of those things. And now we've created another hurdle for ourselves. And this is actually something which I think applies to both tournaments, really. CAF seems to be the one organization that just bends to the will of everything going on around it. I know there's a Club World Cup, and Ali's explained the importance of that. I actually didn't know that English clubs were threatening to pull out, but that sounds very English. They pull out everything, man. Just pull out of the Euros, pull out of everything. But, for Africa, that's a big money spinner to go and play in a Club World Cup. Obviously, great exposure for players and coaches. And it sort of makes sense then to move the AFCON. I just think the rescheduling means we're going to run into so many other problems. Like, then do we play another WAFCON in 2026? Do we move it to 2027? Does it clash with something else? There's a Women's World Cup in Brazil. I don't even think we've spoken since Brazil became the official hosts of that 2027 Women's World Cup, which South Africa pulled out of the hosting rights because of a lack of government clearances. So there is a lot going on. I am disappointed. I hope it doesn't make things lose momentum. I've been spending some time with some of the women's, I'll phrase this delicately, but a women's footballer with whom I'm working on a big project. And one of the big, really huge disappointments and frustrations of women's football in South Africa is, why don't they have money? Why can't they find sponsorship? Why can't they professionalize their league? And, Sundowns, who you've spoken about at length from a men's perspective, are really the only team that can pay their players. So they're paying women's players a decent amount of money per month. They're giving them car allowances. They've given them housing allowances in some instances. And they're getting all the great players. If you score against Sundown in the Hollywood Bet League, they're going to buy you even just to sit on the bench. And I think there's a huge level of frustration in women's football in South Africa and potentially in Africa. But yeah, let that not be for us to forget to watch and to cheer and to support Nigeria and Zambia at the Paris Games, because that's all we're going to get this year.
I mean, is African football missing a trick in the sense that you had 3 of your 4 teams in the World Cup in Australia and New Zealand qualify for the knockouts? And Nigeria were really unlucky against England in their tie. Otherwise, they would have progressed. I mean,
absolutely.
People have said that.
No, it's a huge, and
Oh, you go.
Zayn, it's not just. I feel like when we talk about missing a trick, we talk about it in terms of like administration and kind of officially keeping things going and maybe trying to professionalize women's leagues, and that's all kind of our sort of nerd talk as fans, as journalists, as people with vested interests in it. But I think if you're just talking about baseline missing a trick, Africa has missed a trick to raise awareness on women's football. Women's sport is growing everywhere in the world. We heard about Mary Earps moving to PSG earlier today. That's like a big thing and a big deal. It's in the headlines. I've seen it everywhere. There's all sorts of things going on in the women's game, especially in the UK. And of course, they've got a big media as well, where people are being made aware of things, and the hype game is big. We don't have any of that here. And I feel so desperately sorry for players, because the things they put in and the sacrifices they make to turn out week after week, playing in this Hollywood Bets League, without pay, without knowing what's going to happen next, without even knowing if they have a tournament to go to. It's disrespectful is one thing, but also it fails to capture the imagination of people. And as I mentioned, I was up with a former footballer in Johannesburg and at the club watching what was going on in terms of women's development. It was a cold, I'm going to be careful if I say cold. It was a cold-ish Tuesday night in Joburg. And, Joburg is up on the high altitude. It does get actually quite cold. It was probably about 6 or 7 degrees. Everybody was wrapped up.
Cold.
And
That's officially cold.
That's cold. And there were groups of girls. So they've got girls training from the under 7 level up until their professional first team, or it's not professional, their first team. So you've got all these different groups of girls training, and the interest is there. There were girls of all races, girls of different ages who've come out on this cold Tuesday night, some with their dads, some who are more grown up with their partners, who are sitting on the side of this field, huddled up, training, trying to improve their skills. I mean, Kaylin Twat, the national goalkeeper, was training on her own that day. The first team had been given the day off. She had come to optional training, and I watched her for 90 minutes training on her own, saving balls, doing this, doing that, chatting with the coach. And I just thought that nobody even knows that this is happening. This is so desperately sad. And it really, really makes me frustrated. When I look at the strides made in women's cricket, I hear there's a lot going on in women's rugby because, of course, England are hosting the 2025 Women's Rugby World Cup. So, I was at the Netball World Cup last year. I just don't know how we can convince, whether it's CAF, whether it's individual boards, whether it's clubs themselves who don't have the resources, to do something to let people know that the women's game is thriving. And my fear, Zayn, and it's going to sound a bit dramatic, but is that if we don't, I had mentioned to you when we first sort of got together around last year this time that, whereas the global north is talking about things like specific training for women, especially with ACL injuries now, wider hips, tracking your period, all of these things. Here in the global south, we're just like, can we get paid? And if we don't start to raise awareness, this gap is going to grow and grow and grow. And they're going to be on all this hell of a good research. And in Africa, we're still going to be like, but can we get paid? And we'll fall so far behind. And then come 2027, we're not going to have 3 teams getting to the knockouts. Then we're going to go back to where we were lucky if we had 1. And that really worries me. Like, I'm saying this with my worried face on. I hope you can see that.
We can indeed. Ali, I know we're fast running out of time on the pod, and we can take as long as we need to discuss this, but do you have any thoughts to what Firdose said?
I mean, I think Firdose has summed it up very well there. It's so frustrating, and it's so disappointing. And I think what kills me is that every time on the pitch, the kind of product delivers. The WAFCON we saw last in 2022 was incredible. I think I've said this multiple times on this podcast. The atmospheres at the semi-final and final between Morocco and Nigeria, Morocco and South Africa, is the best atmospheres I've ever been to, even better than the men's AFCON. It was incredible, the atmosphere, all right, and the interest that was grown during the tournament, and not at the beginning of the tournament, because if you landed in Morocco at the beginning of the tournament, there was nothing, there was no signs, no one cared about it. And it seems like that's the way it always is that the players themselves have to take it upon themselves to drive interest in the game simply by being brilliant. But the problem is we've now hit a saturation point in a sense, because we now have the players who are doing the business. I mean, as Firdose said, as we've talked about many times, Rachel Kundananji, Barbara Bandit, the 2 most expensive players in the world. The men's game has never had that, an African player be the most expensive. We have 2 in the women's, right? We have one of the best goal scorers in Liga in France in Tabitha Chawinga. We have Asisa Oshwala. We have Chimaka Nadozie is one of the best goalkeepers in the world. Even I think it was just last night, both Tembi Khatlana and Jermaine Seopasenwe scored in the Mexican Cup final. Everywhere across the world, Africans are thriving in a way that we have never seen in the women or men's game in the last 4 or 5 years. They've just absolutely taken off, and yet there's nothing for them. There's no support, there's no marketing, there's no build up, and kind of as Firdose said, CAF once again is just bowing down to other organizations, bowing down to FIFA, bowing down to the Olympics, not standing up for itself, when clearly it showed both in the men's and women's AFCONs over the last couple of years that it has this amazing product that needs to be shown, that needs to be broadcast. But and again, this was the perfect for me summer to do it, because in terms of women's football, there is nothing. Obviously the men's Euros and the men's Copa America will take eyes from the AFCON, but next summer is the women's Euros again. And I know, personally, as someone who writes oftentimes for European places, who goes on European TV and things like that, is they will not be interested in the WAFCON. They'll cover the Women's Euros. And it won't be until, again, we get to the semi-final and you have this amazing semi-final between Morocco and Nigeria, and they'll suddenly be like, oh, actually, maybe we are interested in this. But that's the reality. Whereas if we had it this summer, before the Olympics, you would have had interest. There would have been engaging, content, and they wouldn't have been competing with much else in terms of the women's game. So I think it's, it's so frustrating. But I think the one thing that I would, perhaps is not console for those, because I think it's even a more terrible plight, is that it's also still really bad here in the UK. Even just look as far as Man U, who are kicking out their women's team from their own training facilities because the men's needs to be revamped. So I think it's, I think while that is a depressing thought, I think it also kind of goes to show that actually the hard work continues and has to continue everywhere, and those changes hopefully will start to come. But yeah, it's so frustrating.
Absolutely. Ali, Firdose, thank you so much for giving your perspective today. Big moves in South Africa at Sundowns pending. We'll wait to see if that happens. And of course, listen, we're here to cover men's, women's, youth. In Courtney's case, the over 45s in Essex. He's not here in our 5 shots. We're here to cover all African football. So certainly value your perspectives. And as I said, anyone listening out there, please engage us. Get in touch with us. OTW_podcast on X/Twitter or Instagram, or you can just search for the On the Whistle podcast on Facebook and YouTube. For those, Ali, have a good week. It's been a pleasure catching up.